White is an achromatic color, a color without hue, an incoming light to the human eye that stimulates all its three types of color-sensitive cone cells in nearly equal amounts results in white. White is one of the most common colors in nature, the color of sunlight, snow, milk, chalk, limestone, and other common minerals. In many cultures, white represents or signifies purity, innocence, and light, and is the symbolic opposite of black or darkness. According to surveys in Europe and the United States, white is the color most often associated with perfection, the good, honesty, cleanliness, the beginning, the new, neutrality, and exactitude. In ancient Egypt and ancient Rome, priestesses wore white as a symbol of purity, and Romans wore a white toga as a symbol of citizenship. In the Middle Ages and Renaissance, a white unicorn symbolized chastity, and a white lamb sacrifice and purity. The widows of kings dressed in white rather than black as the color of mourning. It sometimes symbolizes royalty. It was the color of the French kings and of the monarchist movement after the French Revolution, as well as of the movement called the White Russians, who fought the Bolsheviks during the Russian Civil War. Greek and Roman temples were faced with white marble, and beginning in the 18th century, with the advent of neoclassical architecture, white became the most common color of new churches, capitals, and other government buildings, especially in the United States. It was also widely used in 20th century modern architecture as a symbol of modernity, simplicity, and strength. White is an important color for almost all world religions. The Pope, the head of the Roman Catholic Church, has worn white since 1566, as a symbol of purity and sacrifice. In Islam, and in the Shinto religion of Japan, it is worn by pilgrims, and by the Brahmins in India. In Western cultures and in Japan, white is the most common color for wedding dresses, symbolizing purity and virginity. In many Asian cultures, white is also the color of mourning. The white color on television screens and computer monitors is created with the RGB color model by mixing red, green, and blue light at equal intensities. White in nature and culture. White in nature and culture. In nature, snow and clouds appear white because they are composed of water droplets or ice crystals mixed with air. When white sunlight enters snow, very little of the spectrum is absorbed. Almost all of the light is reflected or scattered by the air and water molecules, so the snow appears to be the color of sunlight, white. Beaches with sand containing high amounts of quartz or eroded limestone also appear white, since quartz and limestone reflect or scatter sunlight, rather than absorbing it. Tropical white sand beaches may also have a high quantity of white calcium carbonate from tiny bits of seashells ground to fine sand by the action of the waves. An individual that has an aversion or hatred for the color white is called a leucophobe. Etymology. The word white continues Old English hwit, ultimately from a common Germanic asterisk chi, wit, as also reflected in ohg on hvitr, goth. Yeats. The root is ultimately from Proto-Indo-European language *kwid, surviving also in Sanskrit sveta, to be white or bright, and Slavonic sveta-white. The Icelandic word for white, vita, is directly derived from the Old Norse form of the word hvitr. Common Germanic also had the word *blankas, borrowed into Late Latin as *blancas, which provided the source for Romance words for white. The antonym of white is black. Some non-European languages have a wide variety of terms for white. The Inuit language has 7 different words for 7 different nuances of white. Sanskrit has specific words for bright white, the white of teeth, the white of sandalwood, the white of the autumn moon, the white of silver, the white of cow's milk, the white of pearls, the white of a ray of sunlight, and the white of stars. Japanese has 6 different words, depending upon brilliance or dullness, or if the color is inert or dynamic. White in history and art. The ancient world. White was one of the first colors used by Paleolithic artists. They used calcited chalk, sometimes as a background, sometimes as a highlight, along with charcoal and red and yellow ochre in the vivid cave paintings. In ancient Egypt, white was connected with the goddess Isis. The priests and priestesses of Isis dressed only in white linen, and it was used to wrap mummies. In Greece and other ancient civilizations, white was often associated with mother's milk. In Greek mythology, the chief god Zeus was nourished at the breast of the nymph Amalthea. In the Talmud, milk was one of 4 sacred substances, along with wine, honey, and the rose. The ancient Greeks saw the world in terms of darkness and light, so white was a fundamental color. According to Pliny the Elder in his Natural History, Apelles and the other famous painters of ancient Greece used only 4 colors in the paintings: white, red, yellow, and black for painting. The Greeks used lead white, made by a long and laborious process. A plain white toga, known as a toga virilis, was worn for ceremonial occasions by all Roman citizens over the age of 14 to 18. Magistrates and certain priests wore a toga praetexta, with a broad purple stripe. In the time of the Emperor Augustus, no Roman man was allowed to appear in the Roman Forum without a toga. The ancient Romans had 2 words for white: albus, a plain white, and candidus, a brighter white. A man who wanted public office in Rome wore a white toga brightened with chalk, called a toga candida, the origin of the word candidate. The Latin word candere meant to shine, to be bright. It was the origin of the words candle and candid. In ancient Rome, the priestesses of the goddess Vesta dressed in white linen robes, a white palla shawl, and a white veil. They protected the sacred fire and the penates of Rome. White symbolized the purity, loyalty, and chastity. The Middle Ages and the Renaissance. The early Christian Church adopted the Roman symbolism of white as the color of purity, sacrifice, and virtue. It became the color worn by priests during Mass, the color worn by monks of the Cistercian order, and, under Pope Pius V, a former monk of the Dominican order, it became the official color worn by the Pope himself. Monks of the Order of St. Benedict dressed in the white or gray of natural undyed wool, but later changed to black, the color of humility and penitence. In medieval art, the white lamb became the symbol of the sacrifice of Christ on behalf of mankind. John the Baptist described Christ as the Lamb of God, who took the sins of the world upon himself. The white lamb was the center of one of the most famous paintings of the medieval period, the Ghent altarpiece by Jan van Eyck. White was also the symbolic color of the Transfiguration. The Gospel of St. Mark describes Jesus' clothing in this event as shining, exceeding white as snow. Artists such as Fra Angelico used the greatest skill to capture the whiteness of his garments. In his painting of the Transfiguration at the convent of St. Mark in Florence, Fra Angelico emphasized the white garment by using a light gold background, placed in an almond-shaped halo. The white unicorn was a common subject of medieval and Renaissance manuscripts, paintings, and tapestries. It was a symbol of purity, chastity, and grace, which could only be captured by a virgin. It was often portrayed in the lap of the Virgin Mary. During the Middle Ages, painters rarely ever mixed colors, but in the Renaissance, the influential humanist and scholar Leon Battista Alberti encouraged artists to add white to the colors to make them lighter, brighter, and to add hilaritas, or gaiety. Many painters followed his advice, and the palette of the Renaissance was considerably brighter. In the Middle Ages and Renaissance, white was commonly worn by widows as a color of mourning. The widows of the kings of France wore white until Anne of Brittany in the 16th century. A white tunic was also worn by many knights, along with a red cloak, which showed the knights were willing to give the blood for the king or church. The Middle Ages and the Renaissance, 18th and 19th centuries. White was the dominant color of architectural interiors in the Baroque period and especially the Rococo style that followed it in the 18th century. Church interiors were designed to show the power, glory and wealth of the church. They seemed to be alive, filled with curves, asymmetry, mirrors, gilding, statuary and reliefs, unified by white. White was also a fashionable color for both men and women in the 18th century. Men in the aristocracy and upper classes wore powdered white wigs and white stockings, and women wore elaborate embroidered white and pastel gowns. After the French Revolution, a more austere white became the most fashionable color in women's costumes, which were modeled after the outfits of ancient Greece and Republican Rome. Because of the rather revealing design of these dresses, the ladies wearing them were called les merveilleuses by French men of that era. The Empire style under Emperor Napoleon I was modeled after the more conservative outfits of ancient imperial Rome. The dresses were high in fashion but low in warmth considering the more severe weather conditions of northern France. In 1814, the former wife of Napoleon, Josephine de Beauharnais, caught pneumonia and died after taking a walk in the cold night air with Tsar Alexander I of Russia. White was the universal color of both men and women's underwear and of sheets in the 18th and 19th centuries. It was unthinkable to have sheets or underwear of any other color. The reason was simple. The manner of washing linen in boiling water caused colors to fade. When linen was worn out, it was collected and turned into high-quality paper. The 19th-century American painter James McNeill Whistler, working at the same time as the French Impressionists, created a series of paintings with musical titles where he used color to create moods, the way composers used music. His painting, Symphony in White No. 1 The White Girl, which used his mistress Joanna Heffernan as a model, used delicate colors to portray innocence and fragility, and a moment of uncertainty. 20th and 21st centuries. The White movement was the opposition that formed against the Bolsheviks during the Russian Civil War, which followed the Russian Revolution in 1917. It was finally defeated by the Bolsheviks in 1921–22, and many of its members emigrated to Europe. At the end of the 19th century, lead white was still the most popular pigment, but between 1916 and 1918, chemical companies in Norway and the United States began to produce titanium white made from titanium oxide. It had first been identified in the 18th century by the German chemist Martin Klaproth, who also discovered uranium. It had twice the covering power of lead white, and was the brightest white pigment known. By 1945, 80% of the white pigments sold were titanium white. The absoluteness of white appealed to modernist painters. It was used in its simplest form by the Russian suprematist painter Kazimir Malevich in his 1917 painting, The White Square, the companion to his earlier Black Square. It was also used by the Dutch modernist painter Piet Mondrian. His most famous paintings consisted of a pure white canvas with grid of vertical and horizontal black lines and rectangles of primary colors. Black and white also appealed to modernist architects, such as Le Corbusier. He said a house was a machine for living in and called for a calm and powerful architecture, built of reinforced concrete and steel, without any ornament or frills. Almost all the buildings of contemporary architect Richard Meier, such as his museum in Rome to house the ancient Roman Arapacis, or Altar of Peace, a stark white, in the tradition of Le Corbusier. Science. Optics and white light. White is the color the human visual system senses when the incoming light to the eye stimulates all three types of color-sensitive cone cells in the eye in nearly equal amounts. Materials that do not emit light themselves appear white if the surfaces reflect back most of the light that strikes them in a diffuse way. In 1666, Isaac Newton demonstrated that white light could be broken up into its composite colors by passing it through prism, then using a second prism to reassemble them. Before Newton, most scientists believed that white was the fundamental color of light. White light can be generated by the sun, by stars, or by earthbound sources such as fluorescent lamps, white LEDs and incandescent bulbs. On the screen of a color television or computer, white is produced by mixing the primary colors of light, red, green and blue at full intensity, a process called additive mixing. White light can be fabricated using light with only two wavelengths. For instance, by mixing light from a red and cyan laser or yellow and blue lasers. This light will, however, have very few practical applications since color rendering of objects will be greatly distorted. The fact that light sources with vastly different spectral power distributions can result in a similar sensory experience is due to the way the light is processed by the visual system. One color that arises from two different spectral power distributions is called a metamerism. The International Commission on Illumination defines white as a color stimulus that an observer who is adapted to the viewing environment would judge to be perfectly achromatic and to have a luminance factor of unity. The color stimulus that is considered to be the adapted white may be different at different locations within a scene. The adaptation mentioned in the CIE definition above is the chromatic adaptation, by which the same colored object in a scene experienced under very different illuminations will be perceived as having nearly the same color. The same principle is used in photography and cinematography, where the choice of white point determines a transformation of all other color stimuli. Changes in a manipulation of the white point can be used to explain some optical illusions such as the dress. Many of the light sources that emit white light emit light at almost all visible wavelengths. This has led to the notion that white light can be defined as a mixture of all colors, or all visible wavelengths. This misconception is widespread and might originally stem from the fact that Newton discovered that sunlight is composed of light with wavelengths across the visible spectrum, concluding that since all colors produce white light, then white must be made up of all colors, is a common logical error called affirming the consequent, which might be the cause of the misunderstanding. Why snow, clouds and beaches are white? Snow is a mixture of air and tiny ice crystals. When white sunlight enters snow, very little of the spectrum is absorbed. Almost all of the light is reflected or scattered by the air and water molecules, so the snow appears to be the color of sunlight, white. Sometimes the light bounces around inside the ice crystals before being scattered, making the snow seem to sparkle. In the case of glaciers, the ice is more tightly pressed together and contains little air. As sunlight enters the ice, more light of the red spectrum is absorbed, so the light scattered will be bluish. Clouds are white for the same reason as ice. They are composed of water droplets or ice crystals mixed with air. Very little light that strikes them is absorbed, and most of the light is scattered, appearing to the eye as white. Shadows of other clouds above can make clouds look gray, and some clouds have their own shadow on the bottom of the cloud. Many mountains with winter or year-round snow cover are named accordingly. Mauna Kea means white mountain in Hawaiian. Mont Blanc means white mountain in French. Chiangmai Mountains, literally meaning perpetually white mountains, marks the border between China and Korea. Beaches with sand containing high amounts of quartz or eroded limestone also appear white, since quartz and limestone reflect or scatter sunlight. rather than absorbing it. Tropical white sand beaches may also have a high quantity of white calcium carbonate from tiny bits of seashells ground to fine sand by the action of the waves. Chemistry: white pigments and dyes. Chalk is a kind of limestone, made of the mineral calcite, or calcium carbonate. It was originally deposited under the sea as the scales or plates of tiny microorganisms called coccolithophore. It was the first white pigment used by prehistoric artists in cave paintings. The chalk used on blackboards today is usually made of gypsum or calcium sulfate or powder pressed into sticks. Bianco di San Giovanni is a pigment used in the Renaissance, which was described by the painter Cennino Cennini in the 15th century. It is similar to chalk, made of calcium carbonate with calcium hydroxide. It was made of dried lime which was made into a powder, then soaked in water for 8 days, with the water changed each day. It was then made into cakes and dried in the sun. Lead white was being produced during the 4th century BC. The process is described as Pliny the Elder, Vitruvius and the ancient Greek author Theophrastus. Pieces of lead were put into clay pots which had a separate compartment filled with vinegar. The pots in turn were piled on shelves close to cow dung. The combined fumes of the vinegar and the cow dung caused the lead to corrode into lead carbonate. It was a slow process which could take a month or more. It made an excellent white and was used by artists for centuries, but it was also toxic. It was replaced in the 19th century by zinc white and titanium white. Titanium white is the most popular white for artists today. It is the brightest available white pigment and has twice the coverage of lead white. It first became commercially available in 1921. It is made out of titanium dioxide, from the minerals brookite, anatase, rutile, or ilmenite, currently the major source. Because of its brilliant whiteness, it is used as a colorant for most toothpaste and sunscreen. Zinc white is made from zinc oxide. It is similar to but not as opaque as titanium white. It is added to some breakfast cereals, since zinc is an important nutrient. Some materials can be made to look whiter than white. This is achieved using optical brightener agents. These are chemical compounds that absorb light in the ultraviolet and violet region of the electromagnetic spectrum, and re-emit light in the blue region. OBAs are often used in paper and clothing to create an impression of very bright white. This is due to the fact that the materials actually send out more visible light than they receive. Chinese white is a variety of zinc white made for artists. Bleach and bleaching. Bleaching is a process for whitening fabrics which has been practiced for thousands of years. Sometimes it was simply a matter of leaving the fabric in the sun to be faded by the bright light. In the 18th century, several scientists developed varieties of chlorine bleach, including sodium hypochlorite and calcium hypochlorite. Bleaching agents that do not contain chlorine most often are based on peroxides, such as hydrogen peroxide, sodium percarbonate and sodium perborate. While most bleachers are oxidizing agents, a fewer number are reducing agents such as sodium dithionite. Bleachers attack the chromophores, the part of a molecule which absorbs light and causes fabrics to have different colors. An oxidizing bleach works by breaking the chemical bonds that make up the chromophore. This changes the molecule into a different substance that either does not contain a chromophore, or contains a chromophore that does not absorb visible light. A reducing bleach works by converting double bonds in the chromophore into single bonds. This eliminates the ability of the chromophore to absorb visible light. Sunlight acts as a bleach through a similar process. High-energy photons of light, often in the violet or ultraviolet range, can disrupt the bonds in the chromophore, rendering the resulting substance colorless. Some detergents go one step further. They contain fluorescent chemicals which glow, making the fabric look literally whiter than white. Astronomy. A white dwarf is a stellar remnant composed mostly of electron-degenerate matter. They are very dense. A white dwarf's mass is comparable to that of the Sun and its volume is comparable to that of the Earth. Its faint luminosity comes from the emission of stored thermal energy. A white dwarf is very hot when it is formed, but since it has no source of energy, it will gradually radiate away its energy and cool down. This means that its radiation, which initially has a high color temperature, will lessen and redden with time. Over a very long time, a white dwarf will cool to temperatures at which it will no longer emit significant heat or light, and it will become a cold black dwarf. However, since no white dwarf can be older than the age of the universe, even the oldest white dwarfs still radiate at temperatures of a few thousand kelvins, and no black dwarfs are thought to exist yet. Biology. Most white animals have the color as a form of camouflage in winter.